Joined by a studio audience of political commentators, journalists, and authors alike to discuss the president's own autobiography, which has been basically ignored by the mainstream media since its publication. Now, perhaps the most controversial portions of the book come when our future president discusses race and the role that it had on his upbringing. And one of the prominent figures that he has turned to on that subject throughout his life has been the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. In fact, he quotes the Reverend on page 93. Listen.
It is this world. A world where cruise ships throw away more food in a day than most residents of Port-au-Prince see in a year. Where white folks' greed runs a world in need, apartheid in one hemisphere, apathy in another hemisphere. That's the world on which hope sits.
Sorry, 293. Joining me now in studio with more on this are two men who have studied at great length the life of Barack Obama, radio talk show host David Webb, alongside columnist and author Eric Rush, who was the person that really broke wide open the Jeremiah Wright story. You know, I've listened to this, I've read this over and over again. I don't think most Americans, I guarantee you, there are many people for the first time tonight hearing the voice of Barack Obama talk about white folks' greed running a world in need. What should they think of that?
Well, I think that they should become a little bit more curious about Obama's so-called faith, the black liberation theology. For example, I look at that as something that is used as it's a device to keep black Americans perpetually out of sync with mainstream America, victimized, resentful, and so forth. When we came out with the story on Reverend Wright, and then Reverend Wright came on and chastised us for not knowing anything about James Cone.
Right.
And so we went out and we read that. If Americans were to read James Cone, they would recoil in terror from the racism.
Let me remind people, you wrote the story, I interviewed you, and then interviewed Reverend Wright, maybe it was a day or two later.
The next night.
The very next night. And he was, excoriating me because I said, if we take the black value system, and every time you use the word black, if we replaced it with white, what would people think about this? But you broke that story. Oh, you were excoriated for exposing this. You still are.
Well, yes, definitely. I mean, because it goes against that sort of racial orthodoxy that they're trying to promote. It's just part of the cultural balkanization that the political left tries to do. It's what they're doing in the black community. There are other ways that they go after folks, students, gays, Latinos in different ways, but it's been very, very effective, as we can see.
What do you think about this? White folks' greed runs a world in need. A president said that, and most of the country never heard about that in 2007 and 2008. And then the president says that he didn't know that Jeremiah Wright was controversial when he's quoting him.
Well, Sean, we have to start from some simple points. Let's be just rational about this. The president is the smartest man in the room, according to the left. He's the one we needed. He's so intellectual. He got to Harvard, Columbia, then all of this mixed together. So therefore, if he's that intelligent, where does choice, and you talked about governance earlier to some degree, where does that come into it? We're about the same age, President Obama and I. And this president had choices to make. I had choices to make as a young man. About those same time in the 80s, I saw all the things he saw. We all had similar timelines. I come from a mixed race family. He said he used drugs as a way to relate with his identity. I come from a family that taught me not about racism, but about working together as a family, as a community, and being part of something larger. Not black values, but American values.
American values, or if you're at a church, Christian values, with brothers and sisters in Christ, right?
And what we have to realize is when we get to that point where we are being taught things, whether by our parents, our influences, whether it's Jeremiah Wright or anyone else, at some point, we have to make a choice. I made a different choice than Barack Obama. He made a choice. We have to stop saying he's a product of how he was brought up. We have to stop making the excuses and accepting them.
So he chose who to hang out with, who to associate with, what value system to adopt, what he was inspired by.
Absolutely.
And he said he would, he would be inspired by and fortified by listening to tapes of Jeremiah Wright when he was on the road. Let's play. He describes in his own words how he and a friend came to use the term white folks and talks about them and being cruel. Here it is.
That's just how white folks will do you. It wasn't merely the cruelty involved. I was learning that black people could be mean and then some. It was a particular brand of arrogance, an obtuseness in otherwise sane people that brought forth our bitter laughter. It was as if whites didn't know they were being cruel in the first place, or at least thought you deserving of their scorn.
This goes right along with what I'm talking about, the difference between choices and presenting things. Obama made a choice. I made a different choice because I chose not to think of white as white, but of one race, human, and different ethnicities. Now, I have an Irish stepfather. I have Scottish, black, English, everything mixed into my family. But yet my family didn't teach me that, but at some point I decided this was a good value system. And I had the influences. Look, I worked around rock and roll bands and nightclubs. I saw the drugs. I was around stars. I was out living the life that people would love to have. But I made choices along the way, and that's important.
Eric?
This is also why Reverend Wright and liberation theology appealed to him, because not only did it have that race angle, but liberation theology in itself has its roots in Marxism.
Marxism, socialism, social justice.
Which is exactly what is, his paradigm. He's never really thought of himself as an American. He sort of thinks of himself as this.
You really believe that? You don't think he views himself?
I don't think so. I think he considers himself sort of a child of the world who needs to teach
Bring
America.
us all together?
To teach America a lesson, basically.
Wow.
Well, but that's a victimology that comes out from Obama.
Yeah.
You have to divide. You have to have people in groups and sectors to achieve equal outcome rather than equal opportunity and risk and reward.
Guys, good to see you both. Thank you both for being with us. And coming up, we're going to compare how the media covered allegations of misconduct in the past of a young George W. Bush versus how they ignored Barack Obama's admission that he used drugs. That's coming up in Media Mash coming up next. And welcome to the special edition of Media Mash as we continue to vet the president and his autobiography, as we have been reporting tonight. Now, the press has been very quick to attack Mitt Romney for the treatment of his dog, Seamus, for his wife's decision to be a stay-at-home mom, and those allegations that he once bullied some kid in high school in 1965. But as we are about to show you, those same standards do not apply to President Obama. Here to help explain all this, the president of the Media Research Center, the one and only Brent Bozell. Brother Bozell, sir.
Brother Hannity, how are we doing tonight?
Let's go back. The president loves to talk about President George W. Bush. Let's look at the media's attack on George W. Bush. The issue? Drug use.
After sidestepping the question for months, GOP presidential frontrunner George W. Bush has issued a limited denial about past drug use, saying he has not used illegal drugs in the last 7 years. An answer sure to raise more questions today.
Did Texas Governor George W. Bush ever use cocaine, or didn't he? The question is dogging his otherwise smooth campaign.
As for whether Bush ever used cocaine or other drugs, his plan to refuse to reply directly to such questions has been modified on the fly as the press and opponents pursue the issue.
There are 13,000 people perhaps watching this broadcast in prisons in the state of Texas who are in prison for either the sale or possession of cocaine. The act of using it is a felony. Is it not germane as we near the election for a presidency? Is it not germane to know that about someone's background?
Now, President Obama admits that he drank heavily, did drugs, plural, enthusiastically, and even admitted to doing, quote, his words, not mine, a little blow, cocaine. Is the media fair?
Sean, it's very simple here. There's one reason and one reason only that George Bush did not come out and say, I did cocaine. He all but suggested it, all but admitted it. But he never used those words for the simple reason that had he said those words, you know and I know, and nobody can deny this, that every single newspaper in America above the fold in screaming headlines would have the next day, Bush, I did cocaine. Every national network news story would lead with story after story after story about how George Bush did illegal drugs. That would have been the end of his campaign. Now, a few minutes ago, you were talking to your guests, and you made a good observation. You said the people you talked to have never heard about Barack Obama doing drugs. Here's this statistics that you're going to love. In 2008, in the primaries, there were 1,365 stories on Barack Obama. How many stories dealt with his drug use?
None. Just a guess.
He admitted he did it. Not one single story on him.
All right.
How is
Well,
that
all
for
right.
a double standard?
Well, now we have the benefit of being able to go back and compare and contrast. We just showed the media coverage. George W. Bush, you heard from Charlie Gibson, World News Tonight, The Today Show, Matt Lauer, CBS, Brian Williams, Meet the Press. Let's watch the media coverage of Barack Obama. Same issue.
I'm thrilled that I have my mother and my daughter with me tonight.
Hillary Clinton's new ad may be uplifting and positive, but a top official with her campaign this week got right down into the gutter, focusing attention on Barack Obama's teenage experimentation with drugs, something Obama has never tried to hide.
Let's use phrases like rolling the dice in an alley somewhere, and the guy used cocaine, and the guy has the the Islamic background. There's a lot of slur aspect to this.
And you said you turned even to drugs, alcohol, cocaine even, because you couldn't find your place in the world. What was that like for you?
You smoked marijuana and inhaled.
Right. I did.
And did a little blow, as you put it, when you could afford it. Explain that.
I mean, it's so transparent, Brent, the double standard.
No, Sean, think about this for a second. First of all, that in all those clips, there's not a single story still. Those are all mentions. There's not a single story devoted to his drug use. But look, think about this for a second. If what Hillary Clinton did in raising the subject of Obama's drug use is getting into the gutter, then what do we say about the press doing it with George Bush? They did dozens upon dozens of stories. Somehow, it's getting in the gutter if you do it about Obama, but it's perfectly okay if the media do the exact same thing about Bush.
Oh, it's amazing. And we do have the one more example, and this is the media coverage. Remember the October surprise in 2000, which I would argue probably had a pretty big impact on the race, and that was the issue and the coverage of the DWI just prior to Election Day, as we may all remember here.
The reporters were all chattering about this and saying, wait a minute, if he's got this skeleton in his closet, what else is there? And some were saying, remember, he never answered those questions about hard drugs.
Governor Bush, as he said later in public, didn't want his daughters to know it. The problem with that explanation is that it doesn't quite pass the smell test.
The Bush campaign has continuously labeled Vice President Gore, rather, in the past as deceptive. So why don't you think this is legitimate fodder for the campaign, given some of the bombshells that the Bush camp has lobbed towards Vice President Gore?
Yeah, right before the campaign, boy, there's an urgency and intensity of moral indignation there, Brent.
Sure, there's a rule of thumb here. If it deals with Obama or Clinton or Gore, let's move on, let's move on, let's move on. That's where we got move on. If it deals with Romney or Bush, the mantra is, let's get back to it. Let's get into it. So we're talking about Mitt Romney on something that happened, folks, 1/2 a century ago. But we have to cover it.
Well, by the way, remember, Republicans, they flip-flop. But Democrats, like the president, they evolve. Very big difference in the coverage.
They don't just grow, they evolve.
They evolve, and Republicans flip-flop. Anyway, good to see you, Brent Bozell.